following program is from NET.
He stood there, alone on the stage, with one hand up in the air, and he was a perfect target. And a man, police say he was Thomas Hagen, ran down the aisle with a shotgun, and the ones with him were already shooting, when the shotgun was right in front of Malcolm X, and both barrels raked him. Malcolm went straight back, and the sound of his head slamming onto the wooden floor was mixed with the screams, and he lay on his back on the stage of an old ballroom. It has been 7 years since Malcolm X was assassinated on a bare stage in New York's Audubon Ballroom in front of 400 witnesses. Shortly afterwards, 3 men were brought to trial and found guilty of the murder. But circumstances surrounding the trial, the assassination itself, accounts in the press, and subsequent actions were so peculiar that 7 years hence, the question of who killed Malcolm is still with us, although 3 men have been convicted of his murder. We must ask the larger question: why was he murdered? What power structure felt so threatened by the words of this one man? There were at different times in his life 3 Malcolms living under separate names and philosophies: Malcolm Little, Malcolm X, and El Haj Malik El Shabazz. To fully understand the threat that Malcolm posed, one must understand his evolution. He was born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska, May 19, 1925, the 7th of 9 children. His father, a staunch follower of Marcus Garvey, was found dead. Allegedly, he was killed because of his involvement in black nationalism. Malcolm was 6 years old. At age 15, after completing the 8th grade, Malcolm quit school and moved to Boston to live with an older sister. He eventually made his way to New York, where he was known as Big Red, and worked as a pimp, waiter, numbers man, and dope peddler. In 1946, when he was 20 years old, he was arrested and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment for armed robbery. While in prison, he was converted into the Muslim religion and became Malcolm X. When paroled in 1952, after serving 6 years, he was a devout follower of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. His first assignment was to set up a Muslim mosque in Detroit. In 1953, Malcolm went to Chicago to live and be trained by Mr. Muhammad himself. A year later, he was sent to Harlem to establish Mosque No. 7. An excellent debater and orator, Malcolm X became the verbal whip of Mr. Muhammad and the Muslims.
Well, sir, if we have sat around here for the past 100 years begging all of the white political hypocrites and every president that has taken office for some kind of freedom or some kind of justice and some kind of equality, and we today yet don't have it, then I think you can easily see that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is right when he says that the only way the black man can be free is when he has a land of his own and a government of his own and an economy of his own, an industry of his own, so he can do the things for himself that he now is waiting and begging the white man to do for him and never gets done.
No matter what happens, we don't teach you to turn the other cheek. We don't teach you to turn the other cheek in the South, and we don't teach you to turn the other cheek in the North. We teach you to obey the law. We teach you to carry yourselves in a respectable way. But at the same time, we teach you that anyone who puts his hand on you, do your best to see that he doesn't put it on anybody else. You don't have any boats or airplanes bringing drugs into this country. The white man brings it in. The white man brings it to Harlem. The white man makes you a drug addict. The white man then puts you in jail when he catches you using drugs. Who is it that controls the prostitution in Harlem? It's the white man. Who controls the large sale of whiskey and wine? It's the white man. You don't have any distillery. You don't own Shenley's. You don't own Old Overholt or Seagram. You don't put the seal on that bottle of whiskey. It's the white man. Who gives you the deck of cards and the dice that you use to gamble with? It's the white man. And after he sell them to you, he catch you with them and puts you in jail for using them.
Malcolm warned against the drug threat long before it had become a popular issue. Because he preached separatism at a time when most blacks pursued integration, Malcolm was not fully appreciated by most blacks during his lifetime. He was often branded a, quote, radical militant because of his outspoken attitude toward whites.
When the Honorable Elijah Muhammad finishes opening your and my eyes and making it possible for us to see this white man like he really is, he don't have to worry about us integrating with him. We don't want to be around that old pale thing. We don't want to be around that old pale thing. We don't want to integrate with that old pale thing. We don't want to sleep next to that old pale thing. No, we can do without him. You find that old pale thing laying out in the sun, trying to get to look like you. That old pale thing. You find him using man tan, trying to look like you. That old pale thing. That old sickly looking thing. And today we see him like he is. There was a time when we used to drool in the mouth over white people. We thought they were pretty because we were blind. We were dumb. We couldn't see them as they are. But since the Honorable Elijah Muhammad has come and taught us the religion of Islam, which has cleaned us up and made us so we can see for ourselves, now we can see that old pale thing to look exactly as he looked. Nothing but an old pale thing.
On December 1st, 1963, at a public rally in New York City, when asked what he thought of President Kennedy's assassination, Malcolm called it a case of, quote, the chickens coming home to roost, which was construed generally as meaning he was happy Kennedy was dead. 2 days later, the press reported a 90-day suspension of Malcolm X by Elijah Muhammad for the comment.
Malcolm, is there really a split between yourself and your former leader, Muhammad?
No, I wouldn't call it a split. Everything I know, I was taught by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Whatever I speak, I'm speaking that which he has taught me. And whatever position I've attained as a Muslim, I've attained it through his guidance and through his help. But during the 90 days that I've been silent, I have come to the conclusion that I can best help spread the solution and the diagnosis that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad gives of the so-called Negro problem in this country by continuing to remain out of the Nation of Islam and working on my own without restriction in the way that I think I best know how.
In mid-December 1963, the suspension of Malcolm X was extended indefinitely.
On March 12, 1964, after 10 years with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X called a press conference announcing his break with the organization and the formation of a new group, the Muslim Mosque, which became the religious body and later the Organization of Afro-American Unity, the political body which leaned toward black nationalism.
That we will do everything within our power to bring about the complete control, political control of Negroes over their own community, over the politics of their own community. And our economic philosophy, which is also black nationalism, is designed to show Negroes the importance of controlling their own economy. When Negroes are re-educated into the knowledge of how to set up businesses and establish factories, they can create their own employment, and then they won't be running downtown trying to boycott the white man or sitting at the white man's door or force him to give them a job. We want to try and show the Negro with the economic philosophy of black nationalism that he can house himself, clothe himself, feed himself, and do something for himself. And the social philosophy of black nationalism is to teach, again, it involves the re-education of Negroes. I hope I'm not talking too fast for you, but I can't help it. The social philosophy of black nationalism is to show the Negro how to take some pride in his own society. How, instead of trying to force himself into the white society, how to elevate how to elevate his own society and get some racial pride, racial dignity, so that he'll be socially acceptable to himself in his own society, and then perhaps he can get along better with other people in other societies. Make the city or state or government, which takes our tax dollars, channel some of these dollars right back into the Negro community and establish better schools in the Negro community with better teachers, with better curriculum. And one of the most important ingredients in that curriculum must be the culture, the lost culture of the Negro. So some effort must be made to restore the cultural roots of the Negro in the school system where Negroes attend.
You seem to have had a change of heart in your attitude toward Negro leaders in the civil rights movement. What position are you taking now?
Well, I think that the problem itself is so big that all of the so-called Negro leaders should try some way to forget our differences. I'm willing to forget anything that any Negro leader has ever said bad about me, and as I said earlier, I am praying that they will also be able to forget the many bad things that I've said about them, so we can sit down and try and find some common approach that can be used to solve this problem that's of common and mutual benefit to all of us.
After his break with the Muslims, Malcolm broadened his scope to include the international scene, and it was at this point that his life was threatened. In April 1964, Malcolm made a pilgrimage to Mecca. Here, at 39 years old, he received the name El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, the honorary Hajj being given to all who visit that Muslim holy city. From Mecca, he journeyed to Nigeria, Ghana, Morocco, and Algeria, finally returning to the United States May 21, 1964. Malcolm wanted to galvanize public opinion against the United States for its oppression of black Americans and to get African support in bringing the American racial question before the United Nations. To do this, he needed the support of independent African states. And so in the summer of 1964, Malcolm returned to Africa for a 4-month tour of 14 countries. In his autobiography, Malcolm notes that he was followed throughout Africa by persons from an unknown source. One of them was described as, quote, a thin-lipped, olive-skinned man.
On July 23, 1964, Malcolm was in Cairo, Egypt, to deliver a scathing attack of Washington's domestic and foreign policies in an address before the African Summit Conference when he collapsed in his hotel room with severe abdominal pains. According to Eric Norden, in an article, The Murder of Malcolm X, Malcolm was rushed to a Cairo hospital, suffering from toxic poisoning, and had to have his stomach pumped. Malcolm later said he had been deliberately poisoned. Throughout the fall of 1964, Malcolm worked primarily on his plan to indict America in the United Nations. According to Eric Norden's information, Malcolm had been under surveillance since he broke with the Muslims, but now there were as many as, quote, 3 different agents shadowing him at one time.
In early February 1965, Malcolm flew to London to address the Council of African Organizations. From there, he was scheduled to fly to Paris to deliver another speech. However, on February 9th, when his plane landed in France, he was told by agents of the French government not to deplane, and he was ordered to leave the country immediately. Later, Malcolm was to say, according to Eric Norden, after an interview with Malcolm's sister, that his being barred from France led him to believe that the plotters of his death were much bigger than the Muslims.
On Saturday, February 12th, Malcolm returned to the United States by route of London. 10 hours later, at 2:45 Sunday morning, the home in which Malcolm, his wife Betty Shabazz, and their 4 children lived was firebombed. The house was severely damaged, although Malcolm and his family amazingly escaped unharmed. In an article entitled The Last Days of Malcolm X, Earl Grant said, quote, evidently, there were several degenerate persons involved in this cowardly attack. The one in the rear had lost control of his flaming bottle and dropped it. Had this bottle been thrown into the house, Malcolm and his family would have been trapped.
On February 20th, he called a business meeting of his new group, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. That night, Malcolm stayed alone in a 12th floor room at the New York Hilton Hotel on 53rd Street and 6th Avenue. His family had been put up by friends in Queens, New York. A man later identified as Thomas Hagen, one of Malcolm's assassins, would be identified by a Hilton Hotel house detective as one of 3 black men asking questions about the location of Malcolm's room the night before his death.
The next morning, Sunday, February 21st, the day of his murder, Malcolm left his 12th floor hotel room, got into his blue Oldsmobile, and finally parked his car a number of blocks from the Audubon Ballroom, where his organization's meeting was to take place. He entered the main ballroom about 2:30 p.m. Shortly after 3 p.m., approximately 400 people had crowded into the ballroom, sitting on folding wooden chairs. One of Malcolm's aides introduced him.
The New York Herald Tribune, February 22, 1965, reconstructed what happened from eyewitness accounts. The applause stopped, and the people sat down, and Malcolm's goateed face looked up and he said, "Assalamu alaikum." And the crowd murmured its response of, "Peace be with you also." And then the 2 lead-off men made their move. They were in a middle row, and they stood up and started pushing each other. And one of them was saying, "Get your hands out of my pocket. Stop messing with my pocket." Malcolm's bodyguards started to move towards them to break it up. And up on the stage, Malcolm stepped out from behind the lectern, and he was saying, "Now, brother, break it up. Let's cool it." He stood there, alone on the stage, with one hand up in the air, and he was a perfect target. And a man, police say he was Thomas Hagen, ran down the aisle with a shotgun, and the ones with him were already shooting, when the shotgun was right in front of Malcolm X, and both barrels raked him. Malcolm went straight back, and the sound of his head slamming onto the wooden floor was mixed with the screams, and he lay on his back on the stage of an old ballroom. Peter Bailey, an associate editor of Ebony magazine, was a member of the OAAU and worked closely with Malcolm X. He was at the Audubon the day of the shooting. That same day, he wrote his immediate reactions to what took place.
I was in the rear of the ballroom, sitting and waiting at the entrance for the speakers who were expected. After hearing 4 shots, I ran into the main ballroom, looked up front, and saw nothing but confusion. The place sounded like a battlefield. I then dashed back out with a group of people running towards me and ducked into the bathroom at the side to avoid the shots. Immediately after hearing the last shot, I ran out of the bathroom and down the center of the totally wrecked hall to the stage. Jumping onto the stage, I saw Brother Malcolm's lying on the stage floor with bullet holes all over his chest. I leaned over him and saw that his skin was already getting that deathly look. There were several people administering to him when I got to the stage. I went into the room where others were holding his wife. I said that someone had gone for the doctor, not knowing whether this was true or not. I then jumped from the stage and started to the rear of the hall to see if the doctor was on the way. It was almost 3/4 of the way down the hall that I saw the first 2 cops that I had seen, and those 2 were just casually walking through the hall as though they were on a Sunday stroll. This despite the fact that people were still screaming, crying, and the place looked like a battlefield.
Several questions arise from press accounts of what happened that day. In all 3 New York morning papers, descriptions were given of the capture of 2 suspects at the Audubon Ballroom immediately after the murder. In later editions of the same papers, and from then on, only 1 suspect was said to have been captured at the scene by police, and the press never questioned this.
An early edition of the New York Times, dated February 22, 1965, in an article headlined, "Malcolm X shot to death at rally here," said, quote, "The police indicated 2 suspects were being questioned," end quote. One of those suspects was identified as Thomas Hagen. In a later paragraph, the capture of the second suspect was described, quote, Patrolman Thomas Hoy, 22, said he had been stationed outside the 166th Street entrance when, quote, I heard the shooting and the place exploded. He rushed in, saw Malcolm lying on the stage, and, quote, grabbed a suspect who he said some people were chasing. As I brought him to the front of the ballroom, the crowd began beating me and the suspect, Patrolman Hoy said. He said he put this man, not otherwise identified later for newsmen, into a police car to be taken to the Wadsworth Avenue station. A late city edition of the same paper only indicated one person, Thomas Hagan, was captured at the scene. There is no further mention of a second suspect from then on.
All early edition February 22nd newspapers were actually on the newsstands the night of February 21st, which is the date of the assassination. In the February 22nd early edition of the New York Daily News, the same thing happened. Quote, 2 men, one the reputed assassin, were taken by police from the hands of a howling mob of Malcolm's followers. Both men were spirited away by the police. Again, later editions made no further mention of a second man.
Because of the mystery surrounding the second suspect, several independent writers in lesser-known publications have wondered if he could have been a police agent, and several other questions follow. What was the other man arrested by Patrolman Hoy doing to make the crowd think him a suspect? The police never explained why they didn't release this suspect's name as they did with Thomas Hagan's. He was described by eyewitnesses at the Audubon Ballroom as a, quote, tight-lipped, olive-skinned man with slanted eyes. The same description was used by Malcolm for a man he said followed him throughout Africa and Europe. One of the most curious aspects of the events surrounding Malcolm's assassination has to do with Gene Roberts, an undercover policeman who infiltrated Malcolm's organization, shown here administering mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to Malcolm as he lay on the Audubon stage. The Muslims claim Roberts had defected from them with Malcolm the year before. He finally surfaced as an undercover police agent at the New York trial of the Panther 13. According to the New York Times of December 8, 1970, Roberts was assigned to undercover work when he became a policeman in 1965, the year that Malcolm was killed, and did not reveal himself until his Panther 13 grand jury testimony on April 1, 1969. The Times says, quote, Detective Gene Roberts said he had been assigned to infiltrate the organization of Malcolm X and was on duty as the black leader's bodyguard the afternoon he was killed on the stage. It is a frequent practice of white journalism for the press to convict blacks suspected or charged with crimes. Nowhere is the example of this practice more blatant than in the case of Malcolm's death.
Immediately after the assassination, both the police and press were quick to blame the Muslims for the assassination of Malcolm X. A quote from Time magazine, March 5, 1965. Malcolm's murder, almost certainly at the hands of the black Muslims from whom he had defected, came on a bright Sunday afternoon. The New York Times of February 22, 1965, in an article by Peter Kish said, quote, about 2 hours later, the police said the shooting had apparently been the result of a feud between followers of Malcolm and members of the extremist group he broke up with last year, the black Muslims.
Besides Thomas Hagan, the one suspect police admitted holding, 2 others were later arrested. Norman Butler on February 26th and Thomas Johnson on March 3, 1965. Both Butler and Johnson were well-known Muslims who were out on bail on an assault charge at the time of Malcolm's murder. Neither was arrested at the scene. During the last days of the trial, the other suspect, Thomas Hagan, confessed to murdering Malcolm X, but said it was others, not Butler and Johnson, who aided him in the assassination. All 3 were subsequently found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The court transcript of the trial reads, Thomas Hagan.
I know that they, Butler and Johnson, didn't have anything to do with the crime that was committed at the Audubon Ballroom February 21st, that I did take part in it, and that I know for a fact that they weren't there, and that I wanted to tell this to the jury, this to be known to the jury, the court, and the judge. I want to tell the truth.
Assistant District Attorney Dermody.
Will you tell us what the plan was, how the assassination was to take place?
Hagan.
4 people, 2 people sitting in the front row, man with the shotgun, short dark man with the beard sitting around the 4th row from the front. Man in the back. One man starts commotion, says, "Get your hand out of my pocket." Guards from the stage goes after this man. Man with the shotgun shoots Malcolm. Two men on the front row shoot pistols.
DA.
And which of these men were you?
Hagen.
One of the men sitting on the front row.
Later in the court transcript, DA.
Do you know the names of these four people?
Hagen.
I do.
DA.
Give us the names of these four people that you say you know were involved with you.
Hagen.
I will not.
DA.
You testified a few moments ago that you were told to do this by somebody. Is that right?
Hagen.
I was offered some money for doing it from people that probably would have been revealed if Mr. Williams,
One of the defense attorneys.
could have continued his interrogation.
DA.
I ask that that be stricken as not responsive.
The judge.
Strike it out. Although Hagen testified that 3 others than himself were involved, only 2 others than himself were convicted, neither of whom was involved in the murder, according to Hagen. According to the court transcript, no further efforts were made in the trial by the defense attorneys or the prosecution to discover the identity of the person or persons who hired Hagen and his Confederates. Who actually ordered the killing of Malcolm? There has been much speculation. Although 2 of the men convicted of Malcolm's death were Muslims, and one, Thomas Hagen, rumored to be a Muslim, there has never been any formal evidence that his death was an official plot of the Nation of Islam, nor that these men convicted were acting under orders of black Muslim officials. The New York Times, dated February 23, 1965, reported that Elijah Muhammad denied that the black Muslim movement had anything to do with the slaying of Malcolm X. James Farmer, former director of CORE, felt Malcolm X was killed because of his crusade against drugs. Author Eric Norden notes that if the Muslims had their reasons for wanting Malcolm dead, so did others. Novelist Jay Kennedy also said it was because of drugs, but specifically named Red China as the force behind the assassin. Malcolm's sister, Ella Collins, said that his death was planned even before he was refused entry into France by the Western power structure. It has been 7 years since the assassination of El Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, but there are still numerous questions left unanswered and many ends left dangling.